Almost every problem being discussed, debated, or argued about today falls under only three headings: social, economic, or ecological. Our problems are increasing and they are global. This shows when it comes to solutions, nobody is getting it right. Everything we make, use, or consume on Earth is provided by nature. Our societies, economies, and nature exist in one hugely complex, interdependent whole within Earth's giant ecosystem, which is made up of smaller and smaller wholes of endless and inseparable social, economic, and ecological complexities and connections. We do not manufacture people, economies, or nature. We make decisions about them. In other words, we only manage them. And all of us manage constantly, from individuals making decisions to governments developing policies. Societies and nature are connected and complex. They have a life of their own, and we cannot ever stop or control them. No matter how much our decisions upset the balance, our societies, economies, and nature will self-organize and continue, albeit in changed form. Our decisions have gradually upset this balance over thousands of years, but it has sped up rapidly in the last century. The knock-on consequences of every human action throughout history can be traced back to someone, somewhere, making a decision or developing a policy. We struggle to associate our problems with our decisions because we are still usually able to meet our short-term objectives, and the knock-on consequences we have set off are invisible and usually only felt sometime after, and often far away from the decision or policy. And we only ever base our decisions on three things. We will either be meeting a need, fulfilling a desire, or trying to solve a problem. And our needs, desires, or problems will only ever be social, financial, or ecological, which means everything else falls into the category of technology or our tools. Our tools and technology are the things we manufacture or produce. Any decision or policy we look at on Earth will have been based on addressing either a social, a financial, or an ecological need, desire, or problem. And the things we manufacture or produce are our tools. We use tools to help us achieve our needs or solve problems in order to make our lives easier as we make decisions about ourselves, our finances, and our environment. We are seeing rapid global technological advances, which means our tools are improving. But at a similar but opposite trajectory, we are experiencing mounting and global social, economic, and ecological problems, which immediately tells us our management is what's failing. Now, we already have answers as to why our decisions are failing, and we have solutions. My father, Alan Savory, is a Zimbabwean scientist who grew up in Africa with a huge passion for wildlife. He has dedicated his entire life to finding out what it is about our management that has caused healthy land to turn to desert over the centuries. He took every management framework and process he could find, both past and present, and began to break them down to the point of decision. And in 1983, he had a monumental breakthrough. He discovered an outdated flaw in our management, which can be found through all ages and cultures, from managing our families to managing entire nations. What he uncovered was that all humans make decisions the same way. No matter what type of management he looked at, when he traced things down to the core or to the point of decision itself, he found an identical process being used every time. No matter who we are or what we are managing, whenever a decision is made, every one of us subconsciously follows an identical process. And it is genetically inherited. We are all born with it. He also discovered this process is not just inherent in all of us, but in all tool-using animals. And our technology also started off as simple stick and stone tools. This inherited decision-making process worked perfectly when our tools were simple because our decisions were simple. We only had social needs to address and could not manipulate or harm our environment with our basic tools. We lived in balance with our environment, with no damaging knock-on environmental or consequences to even think about. With control of fire, our technology began to advance, and things changed completely for us. As our tools advanced, we began to manipulate and harm nature, and at some point we added a financial dimension to that. We had begun to add ecological and economic needs to our once only social decisions. Our decisions had become more complex, involving simultaneous social, economic, and ecological components to consider. But our inherited decision-making process doesn't allow for that added complexity because we are born to only have to address our needs from a simple social perspective. So our inherited process caused us to break that added complexity of our decisions down into simpler contexts or more manageable parts. We began to separate the inseparable and would make our decisions from a social or financial or ecological perspective. This was disastrous because we started to view, study, and manage ourselves and our economies as separate from nature. Today we have endless social or economic or environmental professions. Our governments have separate social, economic, and environmental ministries. And is any minister of finance in the world ecologically literate? No, yet the social and economic stability of every country depends entirely on ecological health. That is the inseparable complexity every policy involves and impacts. A simpler analogy to all this would be to compare it to a government trying to manage a glass of water. Now, water as a whole is made up of inseparable hydrogen and oxygen. But in order to make decisions about it, the water gets broken down into more manageable parts. So governments would form a ministry of oxygen and a ministry of hydrogen, and then each ministry would call an expert for advice. They'd get a top hydrogen expert who has never studied oxygen, top oxygen experts who have no idea about hydrogen, and neither of them have any understanding about water as a whole. And then a policy for the Ministry of Oxygen gets developed, and a policy for the Ministry of Hydrogen gets developed. And this would inevitably negatively affect the water and cause it to become unstable. This is happening because we are not genetically programmed to be able to keep zoomed out to the full complexity of the policy or to test for the short and long-term knock-on consequences on both the hydrogen and oxygen simultaneously. None of us are born with the ability to view and manage water as an inseparable whole. And this is what happens with all decisions and organizational policies. Even when people take a holistic approach or a systems thinking approach or have interdisciplinary teams of scientists working on a project, while they may approach the water as a whole, when it comes to making decisions, they inevitably break it down into more manageable parts and lose sight of the water as a whole. And what's happening globally is hydrogen and oxygen experts keep getting called in to give advice on managing the knock-on symptoms of their isolated perspectives and advice, creating more and more problems. And the water has now become dangerously unstable. Einstein once said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." But that's exactly what we are doing. Our problems are the symptoms of an outdated, inherited decision-making process, but we are using that same decision-making process to try and solve those problems, and we're expecting different outcomes. We are literally stuck on a hamster wheel. And as I said earlier, no matter how much our decisions upset the balance, our societies, economies, and nature will self-organize and continue, albeit in changed form. Just like the water example, they have now become dangerously unstable. These changing forms are the mounting symptoms and the unintended knock-on consequences of global biodiversity loss and desertification, being caused by our outdated reductionist decision-making process, particularly at policy level, resulting in almost all our increasing problems. Droughts, floods, poverty, poaching, wildfires, mass immigration to cities, pandemics, violence, social breakdown, economic instability, and climate change. All of those fall into social, economic, or ecological categories. So, Alan Savory began to try to solve the problem of our inherited inability to manage that added complexity of our decisions, and with the help of thousands of scientists along the way, he solved it by making a couple of slight adjustments to our genetic process. He has developed a new decision-making framework, which is a guiding filtering process that enables anyone using it to successfully manage and balance the ever-present and unique social, economic, and environmental complexity of each decision. He called it the holistic management framework because it is based on the theory of holism, and you're making whole decisions. This framework makes sure the best decision in any given situation will float to the top and become apparent. It essentially makes it impossible for anyone to make a bad decision or to develop an unsound policy, given the unique complexity involved at any given time. The shift to this new process is simple, but it is a conscious one. It involves training ourselves to broaden our perspective at the point of decision, so we are no longer making them from the narrow perspective of whatever need or problem we are trying to address, but from the full perspective or complexity those things exist within. Unfortunately, it is extremely difficult to get any exciting paradigm-shifting new knowledge like this accepted into mainstream thinking and science because it has flown in the face of thousands of years of belief that humans make decisions in many different ways. We now know those beliefs were wrong and they only assumed scientific validity because we have believed them for so long. Throughout history, whenever there has been paradigm-shifting new knowledge like this that goes against what we already believe, it has taken around 200 years for any government to accept that new thinking. And only when enough of the public opinion has shifted and put pressure on governments and organizations do they change. No organization has ever led the change. Someone recently said, "We are terrible at thinking of new solutions." But that's not the case at all. We have new solutions. We are just terrible at accepting new knowledge that goes against what we already believe. The good news is children pick up this new knowledge and thinking very quickly. And the other good news is we do not have thousands of problems to try and solve. We have thousands of symptoms of one problem: how our decisions are being made. But we do not have the luxury of time on this one. We have to urgently find a way to break hundreds of years of institutional stupidity and act quickly and united. All it would take to create a global shift is one brave world leader out there willing to lead this change and set off a domino effect across the world. The first country to develop an agricultural policy using the guiding filtering process of the holistic management framework, tying their country's social and economic stability to ecological health, would be the first country in history to begin to address the root cause of global desertification and climate change. The risk of any government doing this is zero. The reward is securing our future. That is priceless.